Hello everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and I'm doing today part 2 of my series on the knight d2 French. I've had a number of difficulties with this line over the years, even though knight d2 itself looks to be inferior, at least superficially, to knight c3. And one of the ways I tried to deal with knight d2 is the standard knight f6 reply. And generally, I was opposed to taking the pawn with queen b6 and then cd, as I covered in part 1 of the series. And so I've tried a number of different things here, and what I thought I'd do is I'd show some of the ways in which I've had problems in this line, and I think it'll help you understand a little bit of the philosophy of White's position. So one attempt that I tried way back in 2003 was a strange-looking move a5 against GM Larry Christensen. This was in the 2003 U.S. Championship, which Larry went on to win. It's a funny-looking move, the idea of which is that we don't really want to play g5 until White castles. And that's precisely what happened. Castles, g5. And so this is a very blunt attempt by Black to take apart the White center by playing g4 next and then destroying, hopefully, both of those squares. In that game, Larry played d takes c5, and we got a messy position after something like that. And Larry went on to win the game. Probably Black's still okay here, but it's not the kind of position I should have actually been trying to get, especially against Larry Christensen. One of the interesting things about this particular game is, though, that there's been a novelty in this position, which I think highlights some of the creative endeavors White should be thinking about in this position. And that is that White's main difficulty in this position is how to resolve the tension with this knight, the kind of disharmony in the White position. Obviously, it's blocking the bishop, and the knight would oftentimes like to go to f3, but it's blocked. If White can deal with that difficulty, then he's really saving a tempo over the standard setup where the knight goes to e2 and then the knight on d2 goes to f3. Okay, so this move is knight b3. So this is one of the many ways in which White can resolve some of his grief. Now, the first question is c4, but then knight g5, and this is actually a huge mess. For example, pawn takes, knight e6. And that's the end of the ball game, really, because queen h5 followed by bishop g5. So very nice blow if g4 in this position. Still knight g5, c4, bishop h7, c takes, knight e6 again, with a huge attack. Yeah. So a nice example of a piece sacrifice liberating White's discomfort here with the knight on d2. And we're going to see that in a couple of these variations. Okay, so the next attempt that I made in this position was to take and play f6. And on the surface, this seems great because it's like, okay, we take back with the knight, castles, bishop d6. Everything seems to look great. But here we'll see another way in which White resolves the problem of his knight d2. He first plays b3, castles, bishop b2, and now has a very simple plan of playing knight e5 followed by knight df3. And again, the knight on d2 resolves his grief, and then these knights become immensely strong. I've had a couple experiments with this, and none have gone all that well. I think bishop d7, knight e5, queen b6, knight f3, rook e8, rook e1, rook e7, rook c1. White's just playing naturally. Bishop e8. I had this in a rapid game against Krivoruchko, 2600 GM, and his last name means, I think, crooked hand. And here he crooked-handed me here with h3. And the point was just that Black is in a very uncomfortable French position here. The pieces are completely stuck, And this bishop h5 isn't even doing anything because white can afford this small weakness on the king side of the g4. I had to go back. Very pleasant for white. So then I had faced the same variation not too long afterwards. And I tried here knight b4, bishop d7, knight e5, knight b4, bishop b1, bishop b5, rook e1, queen b6, knight df3. And here again, it's still, even though I managed to put this bishop on b1, it's really not that big of a deal. And my opponent, after rook a e8, played a3, knight c6, and here I think was at a beautiful position and just needs to play a couple simple move like queen d2. Like in the Krivoruchko game, there's no need for white to do anything horrendously fast here, because once he gets his knights on e5 and f3, there's not a lot I can do. In this particular game, I was facing Chiera, who is now just got a GM norm recently, and he made the mistake of knight g5, which really is decentralizing white's pieces. And I'm going to give this variation just because I think it shows an instructive mistake of decentralizing your pieces, and not surprisingly something is going to go wrong, as happened here with knight e4. Knight takes, pawn takes, and due to the pressure on f2, I had a small advantage. Okay, so that's been my grief with this f6 line. It's not like black has lost or anything. It's just a very unpleasant position, and we have a situation where he solved the problems with his knight on d2. One other interesting variation here is queen f6. And if you want, you might pause and ask yourself just how you would play this position. And the answer is castles is strongest. We're not afraid of the pawn being snatched on d4. And the main reason is that not only does black open the position and give us some time, but we really solve our main grief here with knight f3. Queen f6, and even just rook e1. And this is the kind of position where you should have faith that white's attack is going to be very strong. Moves like queen c2 are coming, bishop g5, knight g5, pressure on the e6 pawn. So a very nice compensation, typical of this line. And here's another nice variation. Bishop d6, rook e1, castles. And again, you might ask yourself, what's the best way for white to play here? And here we have a very nice solution. Bishop h7, king h7, rook e6. End of the game. Obviously, if queen takes rook, knight g5. So all kinds of strange problems popping up here for black. So what else can black do here? Okay, so another try black has here is to play rook b8. And in a lot of ways this makes sense, is that black isn't in a hurry to castle, and the king isn't necessarily so secure on the king side anyway. So after white castles, then black plays b5 and hopes to say that all of this makes sense for himself. But, white can continue rook e1, and it's not so easy for black to do anything. If, for example, b4, then c4 exclam, and this is a real bitter mess now for black, because his center is going to collapse. And of course, if we open the center while we're better developed, that's a real big problem. And if he ever takes, our knight comes into the game. And whenever our knight comes into the game, we know that we're doing quite well. Okay, so black probably needs to play bishop b7, wasting a tempo, and then very simple play could ensue with takes. Knight b3, we solve the problem of the knight. Castles, knight d4. And now white, all of a sudden, is the one giving black a little bit of grief on the queen side. So a small advantage here for white. And this is all happening because black made these weaknesses on the queen side. Okay. So another variation that's been quite popular here for black is G6. And in some ways, this G6 move strikes me as a misunderstanding. And I'll say what I mean in just a second here. And that is that the idea is castles, bishop G7, rook E1, castles. Many white players automatically, I think a lot of times they're Ruy Lopez players, and they like this maneuver of the knight F1. Of all the places the knight can go, this one doesn't work well. We've already seen knight B3 working well, we saw knight C4 happening, and we saw knight E5 followed by knight F3. But the knight on F1 doesn't really do it for anybody. It doesn't know what it's doing on F1, and here black has had success with takes and F6 French style. And here we see the point of the variation after pawn takes, queen takes, or knight takes, and black is doing totally well. So the way to play it, really, then for white, is to wait and play queen E2. We're just putting our pieces on logical squares, waiting to see where we're going to put our own knight. Now, for example, if takes, F6, let's say pawn takes, knight takes, then we're ready to play knight B3. We're looking at squares like C5, and we'll move our bishop on C1 out. Small advantage for white. So maybe a more dynamic way for black here is to play F6. And now pawn takes, queen takes is possible because there's a little bit of grief by taking on E6 because this pawn will be endangered. And this is in a lot of ways a valuable way for black to think about playing because now he can think about E5 as well. Notice, of course, knight F6 was a nice thought, but DC is really kind of annoying for black. So in this position, queen F6, bishop B5, exclam. This is a valuable tool at your disposal here, bishop B5. In some ways it looks like a patzer move because a lot of fish, when they play against the French, play bishop B5 automatically, and there's no real hope for the bishop usually because taking on C6 is usually such a bad proposition as it both frees the bishop on C8 and gives black a powerful pawn on C6. But here, what we're doing is we're fighting for the E5 square, and we're making it essentially difficult for black to play E5, and if black does nothing, then we have moves like knight B3, knight E5 coming soon. So probably black's best is E5, and then probably we can just snatch a pawn. Something like this. And I don't know, H3 or something, so we can play knight F3 next with an advantage. So one thing I want to stress, and I'll stress this again in the other lectures I'm doing here, is that in the openings, I don't think it's too helpful to try to memorize a bunch of stuff. I do feel like there's some interesting tactical ideas you can get your opponent tricked into, but in general, I think you're trying to get a positional sense of what's going on in the opening. And here, one of the things we've seen is it really is about trying to creatively resolve the knight on D2. Sometimes that involves waiting. Sometimes that involves a tactical play like we saw in the Christensen variation with G5 knight B3. That is white's main obligation in this variation, is to solve that, and you will likely find, if you play this variation enough, that you will find yourself in a position where, which I haven't talked about today, and you will be on your own, and a big part of your problem will likely be that you have to solve the problem of the knight. And that'll simply be up to you then as your own player. So, this is GM Jesse Kraai. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. And in part 3, we're going to look at bishop e7, 3 bishop e7, which is also very topical and I think is not a great move. And since a lot of people play it, I think it gives all the more reason for knight d2 players to be happy to play into the French. So this is GM Jesse Kraai. Till next time. Bye-bye.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for OnlineChessLessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from onlinechesslessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damien for onlinechesslessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.